Okay, you think you know World War II, right? And then, bam, you run across something that makes you stop and go, wait a minute, what?
Yeah, exactly.
That's kind of how I felt with the stuff you sent over about these German POWs,
Uh-huh.
but in a camp in Texas,
Yeah.
Camp Bowie in Brownwood.
Yeah.
And the interview is with a guy who was actually there, a German POW named Heinrich Krefforst, interviewed back in 2007.
Fascinating story, really. I mean, just the scale of it. Over 3,000 prisoners, and most of them from Rommel's Africa Corps,
Wow.
and why Texas? Well, under the Geneva Convention, prisoners, ideally, should be held in a similar climate to where they were captured.
Interesting.
And Brownwood, Texas, apparently fit the bill for North Africa.
Huh. So this interview that we're looking at today with Heinrich, done, years later in German,
Decades later, yeah.
really gives you a ground level view of what must been a really unusual situation.
For sure.
So our mission today is to really dig into Heinrich's experience. What was it actually like day to day for these German soldiers in a Texas POW camp? What are some of the details that might surprise us? And really, ultimately, what can we learn about this really unique situation,
Right.
this wartime human experience, all wrapped up in one?
Yeah.
So let's start at the beginning.
Sure.
Heinrich's journey to Camp Bowie and those first impressions.
Well, Heinrich was just 22 and he arrived at the camp, which is, think about that. You're that young and shipped across the ocean as a prisoner of war.
Yeah.
He describes a pretty significant journey, first by boat to New York City,
Okay.
and then by train. It took several days to reach Texas.
Yeah.
And he was among the first group of about 3,000 prisoners at Camp Bowie.
And there was structure to the camp right from the beginning.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
They were divided into 3 main groups, 2 of 1,000 prisoners each, and then a separate section for the higher-ranking non-commissioned officers.
Right.
The Unteroffizier and the Felsenfeldwebel, as they're called.
Right.
Which it makes sense that even in captivity, they would still...
Well, you have to think about how do you manage a group that size.
Yeah, you got to keep some semblance of order.
Absolutely.
And, I guess also some stability for the prisoners themselves who are in this total alien environment.
Absolutely, yeah, familiarity.
And so, despite being a prisoner of war, his initial impressions are actually surprisingly positive.
Yeah?
He talks about being treated very well and that there was always plenty of food.
Yeah.
Which, that kind of flies in the face of what a lot of us think about POW camps.
Right, sure.
Yeah.
I mean, that detail about the food is very significant, right? I mean, making sure there's adequate food and sustenance, that's like a really basic tenet of the Geneva Conventions.
Uh-huh.
And his account suggests that was being shared too,
Right.
And also the clean living conditions. He mentions that specifically.
Yeah, he says the barracks were clean and nice.
Right. Well, that also shows, I think, a real attention to basic hygiene, which, of course, with so many people in one place, would have been crucial to prevent disease.
Right.
So, that's good.
It wasn't totally smooth sailing from day one.
Right.
He says the first beds that they had in the camp were terrible and that they fell apart really quickly.
Mm-hmm.
But here's where it gets interesting.
Okay.
The American response to this was not what you might expect. They ended up giving the prisoners real beds
Okay.
made out of iron with real mattresses.
Wow.
And Heinrich even compared it to staying at a hotel.
Huh. So instead of just, making do with what they had, the authorities actually addressed this comfort issue.
Yeah.
And that's kind of interesting. I mean, it might show, that they had a kind of pragmatic approach, maybe prioritizing the well-being of the prisoners.
Yeah.
Maybe to maintain order or, simply because that's what they were supposed to do under the Geneva Conventions.
Right.
It's a detail that kind of challenges our preconceived notions about how things were run.
It does. So let's talk about, life in the camp. How did living conditions continue to improve, and what was daily life like?
Okay.
And it wasn't just about having a decent bed.
No, absolutely not. So for the first 6 months, the prisoners weren't permitted to work, but they were encouraged to improve their living areas.
Okay.
And even to do some landscaping. There was even an award, get this, for the most beautiful front yard.
Oh, wow. Can you imagine?
I know, right? These soldiers, they're in captivity, but they're taking pride in their little piece of Texas.
Yeah.
So, why do you think they did that?
It seems like such a human need to have purpose.
Right.
And a sense of ownership, even when you're confined.
Yeah.
And to be able to create something, even if it's just in your little area. It probably gave them a psychological boost
I'm sure.
and also just something to do.
Yeah, absolutely. To fill the time.
Yeah. It's a fascinating detail
Yeah.
about how people adapt.
And then there's this great story about the uniforms. Okay. He describes these uniforms as ugly and says they all hated them.
Yeah.
So what happened?
Well, they found this building that had American soldiers' clothing in it.
Okay.
And they basically, one by one, they snuck in and took what they wanted.
Huh.
And what's really amazing is the American guards, they knew what was going on.
Oh, wow.
But nobody said anything.
Really?
Within a couple of weeks, Heinrich says, we were all dressed neatly. We looked pretty handsome.
So what does that say about the atmosphere in the camp?
Well, there seems to have been this kind of unspoken understanding.
Yeah.
Or maybe the guards just figured, hey, as long as they're clothed,
Right.
you know, we're not going to make a big deal out of this.
Yeah,
It's kind of funny when you think about it.
it really is. Now, of course, life wasn't all about appearances. He also talks about how important soccer became.
Okay.
Every barrack had their own team. Sundays were game days on the field.
He even remembers the name of their team. POW8.
Wow.
And how competitive they were.
You know, that's such a classic example, isn't it, of how people, even in really difficult situations,
Yeah.
they find ways to build community and have some fun, compete a little.
Yeah.
And, having those weekly games,
Yeah.
it would have given them structure, some exercise,
Yeah.
and a sense of, camaraderie, being part of a team.
Absolutely. And speaking of community and routine,
Yeah.
let's talk about birthdays.
Okay.
Apparently, the birthday person was responsible for supplying a case of American beer.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And here's the kicker. Beer was actually prohibited in the town of Brownwood at that time.
Really?
Yet the prisoners had access to it.
Oh, that is interesting. I mean, it just goes to show how complicated regulations and jurisdiction can be, right?
Yeah.
The military base was operating under a totally different set of rules
Right.
than the local civilian authorities.
Yeah.
And it's kind of surreal when you think about it. The prisoners had access to something the locals couldn't even get.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder what kind of conversations might have happened,
Yeah,
between the prisoners and the local people.
totally. So life in Camp Bowie
Yeah.
seems to have had some unexpected comforts, even a bit of a social life.
Right.
But what about opportunities for personal development or even just work?
Right. Okay. Well, after those first 6 months,
Mm-hmm.
they were allowed to work. And one of the opportunities that popped up was the chance to learn English.
Ah, interesting.
Heinrich mentions that there were 2 German speakers within the camp
Okay.
who taught English classes.
Wow.
And he took 2 of these classes, he says, and became pretty good at English.
That's a pretty valuable skill to pick up.
Oh, absolutely, especially for later on.
Yeah.
So what do you think? Why do you think he decided to learn the language of his captors?
Well, maybe it was practical,
Right.
just to better understand his surroundings.
Sure.
Maybe he was even thinking ahead
Yeah.
to future interactions. Who knows? But it is interesting that the camp actually provided this opportunity.
Yeah, that they facilitated
Right.
this kind of self-improvement. And Heinrich himself had a bunch of different jobs.
Okay.
He started with simple things like mowing lawns and building pathways,
Mm.
but eventually his main job was working at the telephone office.
Oh, okay.
And he speaks very warmly of his boss, a German-speaking guy named Major Schroeder,
Wow.
and says he was treated very well.
That's good.
And for this job, he was making $28 a month.
Now, that might not sound like much now, but back then,
Even a small income like that
yeah.
could give you some sense of agency, some freedom,
Yeah.
and, the ability to buy things in the camp.
Right. He mentions beer, cookies,
Yes.
chocolate,
Yeah.
cigarettes.
And it also, I think, suggests a level of trust
Uh-huh.
that they were allowed to have jobs.
Yeah.
And that they were being integrated into the functioning of the camp. And the fact that his boss spoke German
Yeah.
probably made communication a lot easier
Right.
and, fostered a more positive working relationship.
I would imagine.
And he also mentions that just once he got to visit the town of Brownwood
Really?
with a messenger.
Wow.
Just a brief glimpse of the world outside the camp.
That must have been pretty interesting and probably a little unsettling, too, to
Yeah.
be reminded of the world out there.
Yeah.
But he tells this really sweet story about this puppy.
A puppy. Oh,
Yeah, at the photo laboratory next to the telephone office. And he really got attached to it.
Right.
He'd play with it during his breaks.
oh, it's nice.
And it's those little details, those little humanizing moments
Yeah.
that really bring his story to life for you, the
Absolutely.
listener.
For sure.
And he also mentions being able to buy things at the camp. You know, those small comforts that we talked about.
Uh-huh.
He even bought 2 wedding bands.
Oh, wow.
Now, that detail about the wedding bands is really, I don't know, poignant.
Yeah.
The fact that the one for his wife didn't fit her,
Uh-huh.
but he kept it because it was, he says, very good American gold.
Yeah.
That just shows, his hope, his plans for the future,
Yeah.
even in the middle of being a prisoner of war.
Exactly.
At the time he left the United States, he had saved up $132.
That's pretty good. That's, a tangible result of his work.
Yeah.
And being careful with his money.
Yeah. Now, of course, even in this unusual situation, friendships develop.
Of course, yeah.
He mentions a close friend, Stern Jakob,
Okay.
a baker from Oberzissen,
A baker.
who worked in the kitchen.
Right.
And their story takes a really remarkable turn later on.
Oh, tell me about it.
Yeah.
So after Heinrich left Camp Bowie and went back to Europe,
Uh-huh.
he completely lost touch with Stern Jakob for decades.
Wow.
And then, get this, in 2005,
Uh-huh.
he had to have knee surgery.
Okay.
And who was his hospital roommate?
No way.
Stern Jakob.
What?
Isn't that amazing?
Oh, that's crazy.
2 guys who shared this unique experience as prisoners of war in Texas
Yeah.
meet again completely by chance in a German hospital 60 years later.
Wow.
What are the odds?
That is so wild.
So what do you think? What does that reunion say about the bonds that they formed?
It speaks to the power of shared experiences,
Yeah.
especially the intense ones like being prisoners of war together.
Yeah.
How those connections, they can last a lifetime,
Yeah,
across continents and even long periods of silence.
absolutely.
So it sounds like, a surprisingly tolerable experience in a lot of ways.
Yeah,
But of course, they were still prisoners, far from home.
right.
So how did Heinrich feel about his time in the U.S. and then eventually having to go back?
Well, he's very clear that he liked it in the United States so much that he tried to stay.
Really?
Yeah. And he wasn't the only one. A lot of the prisoners felt the same way.
Wow.
They were told they had to go back to Germany first,
Mhm.
and then they could apply to immigrate to the U.S.
Okay.
And I think that says a lot about their experience at Camp Bowie,
Yeah.
and maybe also their feelings about post-war Germany.
Right.
But that path back to the U.S. didn't exactly work out the way they hoped, did it?
No. It sounds like the journey back was pretty much the same as the journey there.
Uh-huh.
Train to New York, boat.
Yeah.
But instead of a new life, they were actually sent to France and held as POWs again.
Wow.
And he said conditions there were much tougher
Real?
compared to what they experienced in the U.S.
Yeah, so after having this relatively decent treatment in the U.S.,
Yeah.
this sudden shift to much harsher conditions
Yeah.
must have been devastating.
Yeah.
And when they got to France, most of the stuff he'd bought,
Oh, no.
the comfort small things he'd managed to get,
Yeah.
they were all confiscated.
Wow.
But luckily, he'd hidden his money and the wedding bands.
Oh, good. At least
Yeah.
there's that.
Yeah.
So his journey back to his family wasn't easy either.
Wow.
He actually escaped the French POW camp
Wow.
with the help of a French girl.
Wow.
And then he had to walk for weeks to reach his hometown near Bonn.
Goodness.
And then, even when he got there, his hometown was under French occupation.
Oh, so he couldn't even go home.
No, he had to settle in a nearby town
Okay.
under British occupation.
Wow.
And that's where he met his wife in 1947.
Okay.
They got married in 1949.
Okay.
And it wasn't until the French left that he could actually go back to his hometown.
Wow, what a journey.
I know, and work in his dad's construction
Wow.
business.
Yeah.
So, all that money that he saved up at Camp Bowie, that $132.
Yeah, what happened to that?
After the currency reform in Germany, it ended up being 450 Deutschmarks.
Okay.
And he and his wife used that to buy their first bedroom furniture.
Oh, wow. That's, that really connects his time as a POW to his new life after the war.
Absolutely. And despite everything he went through,
Yeah.
the long trip home and all the hardships, he still has positive memories of his time in the U.S.
Yeah.
He remembers things so clearly, he even still had some English. And he expresses real gratitude to the American people for how he was treated.
That's really something,
It is.
especially considering he was a prisoner of war.
It is. Now, the interview itself has some really interesting context that really adds to the story for you, the listener.
Okay.
It mentions that many prisoners actually worked in the town of Brownwood.
Really?
They traveled there by bus every day.
Huh.
So it wasn't just confined to the camp.
So what do you think, what does that tell us about how the POWs and the locals got along?
I think it suggests a certain level of integration
Mm.
and maybe even some acceptance by the people in town.
Yeah, and allowing them to work in the town,
Yeah,
I think it shows a level of trust,
right.
and a kind of practical approach to using their labor.
And it makes those accounts of being treated well in the camp
Yeah.
even more believable
Uh-huh.
because they were also interacting with civilians pretty regularly.
Exactly.
So even though Heinrich and a lot of the other prisoners wanted to stay in the U.S.,
Yeah.
the Geneva Convention, as we said, required that they be sent back to Germany.
Right.
So it just highlights how, no matter what their personal experiences were or what they wanted,
Yeah.
they were still bound by these rules and regulations.
Absolutely.
There's also this really important detail about the SS and SA members who were also at Camp Bowie.
Right. Okay.
They were housed separately,
Yeah.
and they were monitored much more closely.
Yeah.
And the interview says that they didn't have the same privileges as the other prisoners
Mm.
and that they were considered dangerous.
Right. A danger to the other prisoners.
Yes.
Yeah.
And there's even mention of several deaths
Really?
under, as they say, unusual circumstances, most likely because of collaboration with the American military.
Wow. So it wasn't all, sunshine and roses.
Right.
This shows a much more complicated
Yeah.
and potentially dangerous situation going on in the camp
Right.
with ideological divisions and different treatment for different groups of prisoners.
Yeah. It reminds us that this wasn't a simple story, that everyone had the same experience.
Yes.
The Americans clearly recognized that there were potential threats from some of the more radical prisoners.
Yeah.
And they had to deal with that.
Yeah.
The interview also mentions briefly that there was another prison at Camp Bowie
Really?
for American military prisoners
Huh.
from various bases in the region.
Wow.
So it was a huge place, clearly.
Yeah, a lot going on.
Many different things happening.
Right.
It's also important to mention the work of local historian Georgia Rogers
Okay.
for saving these records, which are now available at the downtown branch library.
Yeah, that's great.
And they have tons of information about each prisoner. And of course, we owe a big thank you to Clay Riley,
Yes.
the local historian and retired aerospace engineer, for
Yes.
conducting this interview with Heinrich.
Yeah, absolutely.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what are some of the most striking, unforgettable parts of Heinrich Kryforth's story for you?
For me, it's just how different his experience was from what we typically think of when we hear POW camp.
Yeah.
He had opportunities to learn, he made friends,
Right.
he even wanted to stay in the U.S., and then that amazing reunion with his friend.
Yeah.
It really, I don't know, it shows the human side of this historical event.
It really does. And for you, the listener,
Yeah.
we hope this deep dive gave you some of those aha moments.
Yeah.
And a really interesting but thorough look at this truly unique situation.
Yeah.
So this brings us to a final thought for you to consider.
Okay.
How does Heinrich Kryforth's experience at Camp Bowie change how you think about World War II?
Yeah.
And the experiences of prisoners of war? It really reveals just how complex human interactions are,
Yeah.
even during a conflict.
Absolutely.
And it highlights the real world application
Yeah.
and sometimes the limitations of
Hmm.
international agreements.
Yeah.
So what can we learn from these individual stories
Yeah.
within the larger historical narrative?
Right.
Maybe consider checking out some of the resources we mentioned.
Yeah. The Camp Bowie records, for example,
Yeah.
to learn even more.
And explore this fascinating topic on your own.
Absolutely.